Good evening, and welcome to the second 2016 Sir John Monash Distinguished Public Lecture Series. The Sir John Monash Public Lecture Series provides Monash University, Malaysia, an opportunity to engage the community in Malaysia and the region through the promotion of thought leadership in key areas that are strategic to the development of the region in the 21st century. This lecture series takes inspiration from Sir John Monash, who is considered to be one of Australia's most distinguished citizen, scholar, leader, and a man who sought to use his education and abilities for the benefit of the community. The public lecture series cover a wide variety of contemporary and interdisciplinary topics that will be presented by high-profile thinkers, international leaders, policymakers, corporate leaders, and leading scholars who are distinguished in their areas of expertise and whose work have made significant impact to the global community. Today, we are very fortunate that we have Professor Martin Anthony Conway, who will present the second Sir John Monash Public Lecture for the year on a topic titled Narrative Thinking, Memory, Amnesia, and Fictional Memories. I'm sure you're all very keen to hear from the Sir John Monash speaker today on conceptualization of narrative thinking and how it provides valuable insights to memory impairment, generation of fictional or false memories. So before we commence the lecture, please allow me to present Professor Conway's biodata. Professor Conway is a professor of cognitive psychology, Associate Dean of Research, and Head of the Psychology Department at City University, London. Martin Conway, FRSA, Fellow of Royal Society of Arts, has been studying human memory for more than 30 years. He is known for his pioneering theoretical work on autobiographical memory, as well as for his studies of the neuropsychology of memory and memory's neurological basis. His research also includes memory impairment and enhancement, and he has recently explored the links between the ability of humans to remember past events and imagine future ones. A graduate of University College London, Dr. Conway earned his PhD in psychology at Open University in 1984. He worked as postdoctoral research scientist with the Medical Research Council's Applied Psychology Unit at Cambridge until 1988, when he was appointed as a lecturer in psychology at the University of Lancaster. He moved on to the University of Bristol 5 years later as professor and chair of psychology, and in 1994 was named head of the university's Department of Experimental Psychology. In 2001, he accepted appointment as professor of psychology at the University of Durham, where he also chaired the department for 2 years before becoming professor of psychology at the University of Leeds. He subsequently served for 5 years as head of Leeds Institute of Psychological Sciences. Dr. Conway was named to his present position in 2012, a fellow of the Royal College of Arts, the British Psychological Society, the UK Academy of Social Sciences, the Psychonomic Society, and the American Psychological Association. He was awarded an honorary PhD degree from the University de Liège in Belgium. He has been active in providing accessible accounts of research on memory to the lay public through radio and television, and he has been involved in a variety of collaborations with artists that focus on remembering and forgetting. Dr. Conway has been an advisor in many legal cases and he chaired the committee of the research board of the British Psychological Society that produced an influential report on memory titled Guidelines on Memory and the Law, Recommendations from the Scientific Study of Human Memory in 2008. He has published some more than 150 papers in scientific journals and volumes of collected works, and he is the editor or co-editor of 17 books, including, most recently, the title is From the Coach to the Lab, Trends in Psychodynamic Neuroscience, published in 2012. And Memory and Law, Case Studies, published in 2013. Conway is the author of Autobiographical Memory and Introduction, that was published in 1990. Flashbulb Memories, that was published in 1995. And the forthcoming Autobiographical Memory, which will be published by Oxford University Press. May I now request Professor Conway to deliver his speech.
Thank you, Samsel. It's always like hearing your own obituary, these introductions like that. But I just want to thank the university and the president, Professor Bartlett, for inviting me to give this talk. It's delightful to visit Kuala Lumpur. I've never been here before, other than to pass through the airport. And it's been great discovering the city. And I particularly enjoyed yesterday when we inaugurated the new Department of Psychology and the new head of that department, Dr. Hack. And of course, there are new appointments and new staff, and I think it's a great development and perhaps a sure sign of the success of the university that's able to open new departments. Okay, let's move to the talk. So I'm afraid for the first sort of 15 minutes, I'm going to bore you all with some theory. But it's been a long day, so just have a rest. And then after that, I'm going to describe some research with patients and some research into childhood memory that might be more exciting. Okay, let's make a start. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So I'm going to try to, in this talk, and these are kind of new theoretical developments we've been working on. We're trying to move to a kind of new account of conscious thought, if you want. But anyway, I want to bring together a few things. Something called the self-memory system, which was a theory about memory, which we developed really over the past 25 years. I want to talk about a thing called the default or the core network, and that's actually quite interesting. We'll get into some neuroimaging when we look at that. And then I want to say a little bit about narrative thinking, and then finally we'll parcel all that together and move on to look at some patient data and other data where we can apply it. We originally proposed the self-memory system in order to account for the constructive nature of autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory simply refers to memory for the events of your life and also memory for the knowledge of your life. Okay? And it's a type of memory that we, as memory researchers, really only started studying seriously in the 1980s and much more intensively in the 1990s. It's now the most studied aspect of human memory. The constructive nature was apparent from experimental laboratory-based studies, from neuropsychology, looking at people with brain damage whose memories were impaired in interesting and revealing ways, but not just using them as sources of data. We also try to help them to the extent we can, but as you all know, there's no way back from brain damage. Once you've got it, you've got it. But it can be managed if you understand its consequences. More recently, in the 1990s and 2000s, neuroimaging has become one of the major tools for looking at human memory, and functional neuroimaging in particular, where we get people in a scanner and get them to do various tasks, and we look at which areas of the brain become active at which points in a task they're undertaking. And more recently as well, the nature of autobiographical memory in psychological illnesses like schizophrenia and depression has been a focus for research, where problematic malfunctions clearly contribute to those disorders. So the whole point is it's constructive. It's not like a book on a shelf. So if I say to you, I don't know, remember that holiday you had last year, it's not like in your mind you go to some specific place and you pull out the memory and say, okay, there it is. Instead, what happens, as we'll see as we go through the talk, is that you construct memories from lots of different sources of knowledge, and the whole neocortex is involved when you remember. I like to say it's a bit like the brain breathing a memory. So it's not like picking something off a shelf. That's a key point. We don't need to bother with this, but it's just a bee in my bonnet, and that is that memories are constructed, not reconstructed. So if you say they're reconstructed, what you're really saying is they're reconstructed from something in the past, whereas it seems, from all we now understand, that's probably not quite the case. So memories consist of different types of knowledge, some conceptual, some episodic. It's episodic in the sense that the knowledge that's brought to mind refers to a specific moment in time, specific place, specific experience. But there's also lots of conceptual knowledge in there as well. For example, I just gave you the example of recalling your memory of a holiday you had last year. Well, recalling your memory of a holiday you had last year, the holiday last year is conceptual knowledge. It's not episodic. But without it, you probably can't get to your knowledge of this marvellous holiday that you had. So both these types of knowledge, conceptual and episodic, are part of long-term memory. And a specific autobiographical memory has a kind of transitory existence. It's a sort of pattern of activation that comes into being across various networks in the brain. We'll see some more of that shortly. That includes both conceptual and episodic knowledge. Very briefly, let's just have a brief look. I don't want to dwell on this because now's not the time to go into it all, but just to have an idea of what these knowledge structures might look like in long-term memory. So there's a whole set of conceptual knowledge, the most abstract being what's sometimes referred to as the life story. And then there are other kind of themes that run through one's autobiography, themes to do with work, relationships, places you've lived, etc. And these link into things like working at a particular university, being friends with a particular person. And these knowledge structures contain information about places, objects, others, activities, goals that characterize that time. And that knowledge can be used as a cue to access more specific knowledge. For example, going to departmental talks when you worked in a particular university, which in turn can then be used to access, and I've depicted these episodic memories here as a set of gravestones. There's nothing significant in that. They're just little discrete clumps of knowledge which can be accessed, and then a pattern of activation might build up across all of these networks, and that will be your memory in a particular episode of remembering. And the way that pattern of activation comes into being is by control processes elaborating cues. So if I say to you, tell me about your holiday last year, you might think, blimey, what did we do? I remember we went to this fantastic beach. Right? And so what you're doing is you're elaborating the cue, and you're using that knowledge to probe the knowledge base to try and activate relevant knowledge in that particular task. And there are a set of complicated control processes, largely in networks in the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes, that mediate that process of cue elaboration and probing the knowledge base to create the pattern of activation that is eventually going to be the memory in that particular task. Just to underlie this complexity, when a memory is constructed in the brain, then the brain images tell us that areas of the frontal lobes and posterior parts of the brain become highly active over the course of memory construction. Now, they're big regions of the brain. It's not like some little spot, some little collection of tiny neurons becoming active. It's like huge networks coming online. And you can see some of them here in a summary figure from Roberto Cabeza and Peggy St. Jacques. So this is the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes, where the executive processes are. And this is where the cues are being elaborated. And then back here in the posterior part are networks that mediate visual imagery. It's an interesting fact. If you suffer a damage to the posterior part of the brain, to these visual areas, then you can become amnesic as a secondary consequence. So, in fact, you still remember conceptual aspects of your life. You know, I went to St. Mary's Grammar School, etc., but you can't recall any specific memories. And that's typically because memories are represented in the form, specific memories, episodic memories, in the form of visual images. So if we lose the ability to generate visual images, we have a certain sort of amnesia. We can no longer have specific memories. Anyway, the whole point of this overhead is to get across this idea that huge areas of the brain become active when we remember. And that's probably why almost any form of brain damage leads to some type of memory impairment. Although there are some types that lead to very marked memory impairment. But more recently, there's been the discovery of what has become termed the default or core network. And this is a complex network distributed through the neocortex and limbic system, and various specific areas as well. We'll have some pictures of it in a minute. The default network is active when attention is not task-focused. And it's sometimes called the resting state. So in the early neuroimaging studies, they put people in a scanner and they'd say, well, I'd like you to remember your holiday last year. And then the control condition would be, don't do anything, just lie there. Right? And then they take the two patterns of activation arising from either state and subtract them one from the other to determine what was unique about the experimental condition, which in this case is remembering your holiday. Of course, there is no such thing as the brain resting. It doesn't even do that while you're asleep. And what they discovered was that in the resting state, there is quite extensive activation going on in the frontal lobes, in posterior areas of the brain, on both sides of the brain, right and left hemispheres. And what's remarkable is this pattern of activation, this complicated pattern of activation, is almost identical to what happens when you remember. Right? So this is remembering, this is thinking about the future, and this is doing a theory of mind task. I'm not going to go into that, but this shouldn't really surprise us, because after all, what do we do when we're not task-focused? Well, we daydream. We think about the past, we think about the future, we think about our friends, we think about things we're going to do, we think about things we have done, we think about how the past might have been otherwise. There are lots of things we do when we're not task-focused. But by and large, they all involve some form of remembering. Some people refer to this as daydreaming, but for us, daydreaming doesn't really capture the fact that this type of mind wandering is always purposive, even if we don't know ourselves what the purpose is in what we're imagining or daydreaming about. And so we've taken to recasting daydreaming as what we call narrative thinking. And the type of narrative thinking we have in mind was described by a philosopher called Peter Goldie, in a book in 2012 called The Mess Inside. But he is a philosopher, so I wouldn't recommend reading it. It's a bit user hostile. He pulls out various aspects of narrative thinking which are of interest to us in our study of brain damaged patients. Three features are that narratives are coherent, they involve meaningfulness, and they're evaluative and have emotional aspects to them as well. In terms of coherence, what he means by that, he uses a concept from another philosopher called emplotment. And what's really meant by that is sort of configuring a list of items into some thematic whole. So a narrative is not just a list of items, it's some thematic representation of items. Meaningfulness is interesting. Goldie argues that narratives have two sort of perspectives to them. One's an internal perspective, so you can be in a narrative and taking part in it. And the other is an external perspective. So a narrative can be meaningful by revealing the narrator's external perspective. So we can, when we're daydreaming, look into narratives, or we can actually be in the narrative. It's interesting. And these two perspectives are interrelated. I don't need to dwell on that. But I do suggest that this kind of flickering back and forth between internal and external perspectives is exactly what occurs when we're constructing memories and narratively thinking about our lives. We flip between these perspectives. In the world of memory research, we tend to refer to these things as field perspective, meaning you have something like your original perspective from the original experience, versus observer perspective, which refers to the fact that you see yourself in the memory. And people can flip between those two different views, although I wouldn't want you to think that there's anything straightforward about them, because if you ask somebody, what do you look like if you see yourself in a memory, then you get some very strange answers. Nonetheless, people claim to be able to do it. And within these narratives, they're evaluative and emotional as well. I don't really want to go into that aspect right now. So the suggestion is that when we're in default mode in the core network, we're engaged in narrative thinking and creating coherent, meaningful, evaluative and emotional mental representations about ourselves. And these will include conceptual autobiographical knowledge, some episodic memories, and memories of future events as well. I can't whether you can really use that phrase, memories of future events, but imaginings of future events and imaginings of how the past could have been otherwise. And while narratively thinking, we oscillate between the internal and external perspectives, creating narratives that have both experiential, wishful, and critical aspects to them. And sometimes these narratives become memories or experienced as memories. So if we recall a narrative, we might recall it as a memory, mistaking it for a memory when it's not. And we'll come to some of that in a minute. And that may happen because they're generated in the same brain networks that we represent memories. So imagining something and remembering something are really rather similar sorts of activities in terms of the brain. In fact, we've now gone to the position where we refer to what we call the remember imagining system rather than the memory system. The idea being that remembering and imagining are very closely interrelated. So within this narrative approach, Goldie singles out what he calls fictionalizing tendencies, and this is something I'm quite keen on. And so he says we have a tendency to structure our autobiographical memories that it was a story. All right? And so memory tends to be a bit like fictional narratives. But you might want to say, well, maybe it's the other way around. You know, maybe memory is the way it is, and fictional narratives are derived from memories. I mean, it could work both ways. It's probably interactive. Whatever the case, we all have our story, and perhaps several of them at that. And the life story has become a big area of investigation in memory research in recent times. Goldie identified 4 main fictional tendencies. We plot our lives, so we have a life story. We look for agency where there is none. You know, why did she say that? I don't know, but maybe it was for this reason, when of course we don't know why she said it. Or why did he do that? We've no idea, actually, if the truth were told, but we can, try and find some agency there. Within these fictionalized tendencies, there's a desire for a narrative thread, for coherence, and for closure. So narratives should, cohere together, they should tell a story, and they should have an ending. And finally, an important aspect of fictionalizing tendencies is that the character of the people who are in one of these narratives, right, has to be consistent. So you can't have, in a story, a brave hero who is also a coward, right? And perhaps this is the case in our narrative thoughts as well. And we'll look at a bit of that in a minute. Some psychological characteristics of narratives, that they contain visual imagery, they involve feelings and emotions and specific thoughts. And we think that multiple narratives are active in parallel and they interfere with each other. So when you're sitting there daydreaming away about, your upcoming holiday, you suddenly get interrupted by thoughts about something you have to do in the office today. So these different narratives are running alongside and competing with each other. And we believe that this type of narrative thinking, which is very dynamic, plays an important part in cognition. And the purpose of it is to maintain a dynamic self-system. So without this type of ongoing sort of conscious cognition, then the self would become stagnated and no longer have its dynamic aspects. Okay, and this happens offline when we're not task-focused. The brain defaults to running these narratives, which are kind of, if you want, tuning up the self. So one implication of this view is if the capacity for narrative thinking is disrupted or impaired, then there will be changes in conscious thought when cognition is not task-focused. And indeed, Joseph Ledoux, in some of his early neuropsychological work with anterior cingulate patients, these are people who've got lesions in the anterior cingulate, they report no daydreaming. They just say they're blank. So Ledoux would say to them, well, what have you been doing for the last 30 minutes? And they'll just say nothing. My mind was blank. So they don't daydream. So let's see how we can extend some of this thinking to various types of patients and to childhood memories as well. So the theory bit's now over, you'll be relieved to hear. So we've been looking at narrative thinking in patients. And I want to start out with a patient we looked at actually a number of years ago who confabulated. Confabulation was referred to by Morris Moscovich, a famous neuropsychologist from Toronto, as honest lies. And I think that's a very nice phrase to capture it, because when a patient confabulates, what they're telling you is usually true of their life. It's just the elements of it are configured in a way that's false. And it's actually quite difficult to know that they're confabulating unless you have the help of relatives and partners who can tell you, this isn't right, this never happened. So patient OP is a 70-year-old woman who was run over by a car outside Bristol Royal Infirmary in the 1980s. She was fortunate in the respect that she was literally outside the Royal Infirmary, because she would have died otherwise, but they got her straight in the hospital and got the anti-inflammatory drugs in her brain, and that saved her. After she recovered, she had quite bad orthopedic injuries, but she recovered from those remarkably well. Her family complained to a colleague of mine who was actually a nurse on this particular ward, who was doing a part-time PhD with me, that she kept lying all the time. And this was a clue to us that she was confabulating. And in fact, her confabulations were largely about her grandson, they depicted a past of family bliss, all resting on a range of false memories. These memories that when he was a young boy, he would cycle out to see her and her now deceased husband in their house in a village outside Bristol. In fact, an 8-year-old boy cycling on the M5 in the west of England is pretty implausible. One of the major motorways. And lots of other memories like this. And in fact, I got to meet him, and he was a bit of a Bristol slob, really, and he really hadn't had much to do with her at all in his life. And it seemed to us that these fictional memories, these false memories, for her, made a very difficult present much more bearable. And she related to them everyone, even strangers. She stopped people on the street and said, "Do you know about my grandson?" And then tell one of these memories. So this is kind of narrative thinking out of control, really. Another patient AO, had a frontal lesion on the right side of the brain and developed enduring paranoid confabulations coupled with denial of her physical disabilities. So she was paralyzed. There's a right hemisphere lesion that normally leads to paralysis on the left side of the body. So if you said to AO, "Can you walk?" she'd say, "Of course I can walk." But she couldn't. "Can you raise your hand?" No. If you say to these patients, "Can you clap your hand?" say yes. And Ramachandran, a famous neuropsychologist, reports, "I've never tried this with a patient because it seems a bit unethical," but he said, "Well, if you can say you can clap your hands, clap them, and they'll just do that." So for them, that's clapping. AO's confabulations often centered on the nursing staff, and this is not uncommon with patients with these sorts of brain injuries, who she variously remembered taking money off her, moving her bedroom during the night. Frontal patients have very disturbed sleep cycles. They wake up and they don't know where they are, and they often assume that their bedroom's been moved. So if you see them in the morning and say, "How are you?" It's, "Oh, terrible, I didn't get any sleep last night at all. They moved my bedroom 3 times." All right? Which, of course, never happened. And she also had some more pleasant false memories. So she repeatedly recalled going walking in the very recent past, like yesterday or the day before, in her childhood village in Scotland. She was actually in a care home in Newcastle, which is obviously not in Scotland. So she couldn't possibly have done that. And also, she couldn't walk because she was paralyzed on her left side. So these fictional memories of AO's, which kind of make sense. They're trying to make sense of the world, make a narrative of a very difficult present in which her physical injuries were attributed to the nursing staff, who gave her impossible chairs to sit in. So if you said to her, "Well, you say you can walk, can you stand up from that chair?" And she'd say, "No, because the nurse always gives me this chair because she knows I can't stand up from it." Right, so you can imagine how light she was in the nursing home. So these memories seem to have a sort of external perspective. It's like she was looking in on them in a kind of critical sort of way and trying to make sense of her very difficult present. The memories of walking in her village, which may have been true autobiographical memories, but just wrongly attributed to being last week rather than 30 years ago, 40 years ago, provided her with quite a lot of comfort. So she's got 2 things going on here, really, a kind of negative narrative, which is trying to make sense of the present, and the fact that she's paralyzed, which she's in denial about. And then these more pleasant memories, which give her some comfort and make her feel that she's still, an able person in the world. Right, let's move to another patient of ours, interesting patient, patient CR. And she has a large right temporal lesion. So lesions in the right temporal lobe are really not very good news. She's got anterograde amnesia, so in other words, she can't form new memories. In fact, she can form new memories. What's interesting about her is she can't remember them. So if you say to, she's called Claire actually, so if you say to Claire, "Can you remember, what did you do this morning?" she can tell you. But if you say to her the following day, "What did you do yesterday?" she has no idea. So she forms memories and then loses access to them. She's also prosopagnosic, so she can't recognize anybody. And she can't recognize herself. So she once told us a story of how she'd been on the tube in London, and this woman kept staring at her all the time. She was getting really uncomfortable about it. But the woman was actually her reflection in the window opposite her. Right? And she had a similar thing in a swimming bath where she was getting changed, and this woman kept looking at her all the time from the mirror, and it was actually her. We've worked with her for blimey, 12 years now, she's never recognised myself or my colleague Catherine Loveday once. She can recognise Catherine if she wears certain sorts of clothes, but after 12 years, Catherine's not very keen on wearing those clothes. So, she's a very good semantic processor, and we've managed to help her improve her memory, but using a camera. And that's helped build her self-confidence. You can imagine what it's like. You can't recognise anyone in the world. You can't remember anything. And she's got retrograde amnesia as well, so she can remember very little of her own life. Then that's a pretty bad basis to start your social interactions from. But if she uses this camera, she can look at the pictures before she meets someone, and then she remembers meeting them, at least for a short time. She doesn't confabulate. That's her lesion. This is just a 3D image. This is the right side of the brain. You can see it's a huge golf ball-sized lesion caused by encephalitis. Right. On the other hand, her left hemisphere is intact. So it's probably the case that she can encode memories, but the right hemisphere pathways, which would normally allow you to access the memories, have obviously been disconnected, and she can't use those. And therefore, she can't remember events. Right, so after about 10 years, we asked her about daydreaming, which we never thought to ask her about before. And she gave a vivid description of her experience, which is, this is her own words, of the world continually crashing through my mind. Right? So she can't control it. You know, everything's crashing through. And what she does, and we noted this before, we never knew why she did it, she plays solitaire all the time. She'll play it for hours on end. Or she'll draw. She particularly likes drawing pictures of trees, and she'll spend a lot of time doing that. And this is all to try and control this experience of the world crashing through her mind. As, you know, her narrative function is obviously completely broken down, and now the present is just running continually, and she can't inhibit it. And she can't do mind wandering. Narrative thought is not something Claire can still do. Okay, another patient, MB, just started working with this guy. He's also really interesting. He's got some injuries in the middle temporal lobe and in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. The temporal lobe, of course, is crucial in memory. And he complains of what he terms uncontrolled, continuous recall of memory. And I'll read out some of the things that he says. He says, if I go for a walk and then I buy something at the shop, while talking to the checkout operator, I'll get repeated images of what I saw when walking entering my mind, which just ruins my proper concentration. When, say, I do the dishes, I will get the constant recalling of images of doing the vacuuming previously. He's a gardener. So if I dig a ditch, then the next day while mowing the lawns, I'll get memories from digging the ditch keep turning up. These memory intrusions are permanently there. It's like my mind's eye is continuously trying to concentrate on the outside world, but it's having to do that while looking through a previous memory. I think it's a particularly good description. And he says, I've had a few very brief moments of remission since 1994 when this condition started. And in these 3 moments, each about 5 minutes, the intrusion of the memories clears and I feel bored. And then I start planning life again. So this is one of the functions of narrative thinking. Before I then slip back into this dysfunctional emergence of memories. And he said, I suppose it may sound odd, but I can never feel bored as my mind is always full of this memory or a memory, even when I sit still and do absolutely nothing. So this is another patient who's kind of lost control of narrative thinking. It's intruding all the time. But in fact, that may be what's going on with all of us. But we have control processors who just keep that stuff below the level of consciousness. They say, okay, we don't want to be thinking about what we're doing next week or what happened on our holiday last year because we're a bit busy giving a talk at the moment. So keep that stuff out of consciousness. But then if you suffer brain damage, it might be you no longer have the resources to inhibit these narratives, and then they come to mind all the time. So MB's problems might be due to failure to inhibit narrative thinking. Okay, one more patient, and we'll talk a bit about childhood. So patient MW is an interesting character, ex-policeman actually, and he has false memories of both the past and the future. Confabulates on a daily basis, and often his confabulations are incredibly skillful. Such that their falsity doesn't come to light until later. So he related to his wife a highly elaborate and convincing memory of a long phone call with a colleague's wife in which he learnt about the death of this old friend of his. And she sent a letter of condolence to the family. And only then, when the wife rang her up, did it become clear that the husband was still alive and very healthy. And maybe this might resonate with some of you, you know, very elderly people quite often end up doing things like this. So we tested his sort of memories, as it were, and we asked him to imagine things that might happen in the future, and we gave him cue words to do that with. So we gave him a word like garden. Can you think of something that might happen in the future related to that word? All right, and he always did these fantastic confabulations. So he would say, I own a garden on the moon and all the other planets. And then my PhD student, Scott, would prompt him and say, well, can you give me a specific memory then? And he said, I will have them all on the planets, and I will grow plants indigenous to the planets. To the keyword mountain, he said, I will buy Mount Kilimanjaro and Mount Fuji, and he's prompted for a specific event related to those that might happen in the future. And he says, I'm going to rent them out. So if Sir Anthony Hopkins can own Snowdon, which is a mountain in Wales in England, and Sean Connery, 007, can own Ben Nevis, which is a mountain in Scotland, I can own Kilimanjaro. And he says, I would live on the summit of Mount Fuji, I would have a house on there and another one on Kilimanjaro. MW's false past and future memories, he confabulates about the past as well, seem to involve a rather transitory emergence of personal meanings, and only a few of these meanings persist, all right, over the time we've been working with him. So these are like narratives that come online and then go off and are forgotten. And we think there's probably some kind of continuous attempt to develop narrative meanings in a memory system. The default network, the core network, is no longer constrained, it's no longer functional. We can still generate narratives, but we can't control them, and it can't make them real, as it were. Recently, we tested a group of Alzheimer's patients. These were in the very early stage of the disease, and we used a thing called the Warwick Edinburgh Wellbeing Scales, and these include a number of questions about daydreaming. But none of the patients could answer those questions, and they all claimed to never daydream. So it might be an aspect of these pathological aging that one begins to lose the ability to have narrative thinking. It certainly seems to be the case in these Alzheimer's patients, and we're now pursuing that further. And what we wonder is, could we teach them to have daydreams again, to have narrative thinking? And we're kind of working on that at the moment. We obviously tested a control group of some healthy older adults, aged 80 to 100. And they were all able to complete the questionnaire and claim that they daydreamt for about 25% of their working time, which is pretty common, actually, if people are being honest when they answer these questions. So narrative thinking seems to be intact in old age. It's only in pathological old age that it appears to become a problem. These are just the first steps at looking at these groups. We suspect that disruptions to conscious thought in mind-wandering, daydreaming, narrative thinking might be much more common than we're currently aware. After all, very few people go to the doctor and say, I'm having problems daydreaming. But they may well be having problems daydreaming, but they just don't know how to conceptualize that or don't realize its significance. And so there could be a lot of underreporting going on here. And also there may be large individual differences. I mean, there is an issue about how aware different people are of their own conscious thought. And it seems as though some people have less awareness than others. Some people claim not to have, for example, visual mental images. But if you give them tests that require you to use visual mental image, they perform just as well as anybody else. So the suggestion is that they do, in fact, have visual mental imagery, they're just not consciously able to be aware of it. Okay, let's move on to some childhood memories. All right. So fictional or false memories in childhood are more numerous than previously thought. So if you ask people, do you have any memories from childhood you're a bit kind of dubious about? It might not be a memory, I'm not sure, I don't know. Then about 20% of people are able to give you at least one memory that they think is probably false, and sometimes which clearly has to be false. So my favourite one is of a man who claimed to have a memory of being in a park with his mother when he was a little boy, watching dinosaurs walking over a hill in the background, right, which I think is a rather nice memory. But a lot of these, they're called unbelieved memories, do have fantastical aspects to them, or the people who have them claim to experience them as memories. Often they're associated with more negative experiences. Another aspect of childhood memories is the sort of perspective one has on them. And in our lab, we've done a lot of work looking at when people recall childhood memories in which they see themselves. They're called observer memories. And we ask them what they look like. We ask them lots of other questions as well. What are you wearing in this memory that you see yourself in, etc. Usually they can't answer these questions. But more often than not, if they claim to see themselves, the image they have of themselves is from a family photograph when they're a child. So that family photograph has somehow been melded into their narrative of their memories of childhood. Here's an example of a very vivid memory from childhood, which is interesting. So this is a middle-aged man, I'll read this out. Recalled his father distracting him when he was a young boy, about 4 years old, by asking him who was the first man on the moon. He'd been intensely interested in the moon landing when he was a young boy, and this incident occurred while his father was on the telephone to his mother, who'd just given birth to his younger brother. Not a great experience for a young boy. And in those days, men weren't allowed in hospitals, so he had to ring her up. He had a vivid and fond memory of his father placating him in this way, and he was highly agitated by the birth. And in his memory, he could see his father on the phone and almost hear his voice. That's how vivid the memory was. But it was only decades later, actually during a talk I was giving, that he realized that his brother had been born in 1968, 1 year before the moon landing. So the memory has to be wrong. Now, it could be that this is an event that has just been misdated, although he didn't have any other siblings, so it seems unlike it. But the point about it is it's a bit like the fictionalizing tendency of making a character consistent. So what the memory does is it defines his father as a very supportive sort of father who cared for his son and wanted to help him through a difficult period. Right? So even though the memory itself must be false, it nonetheless contributes to characterizing his father in that way. So maybe the fictionalizing tendency of making the character in a narrative consistent is what's influencing the emergence of this particular false memory. Now, probably the most extreme example of some of these effects of the coherence of a narrative are to be found in adult recollections of childhood sexual abuse. Now, I've been an expert witness in England for well over a decade in a lot of these cases. Right? As a memory researcher, they're really very problematic cases. Typically a complainant, which is what the person who is making the accusation is called in the courts will have had a very adverse childhood, often involving neglect, episodes of emotional and psychological abuse, domestic violence, and interventions by social services. And in subsequent adolescence and adulthood, their passage through life is marked by failed relationships, negative emotional experiences, and very, very often extensive substance abuse. The memories of these complainants often date to when they were allegedly 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, periods for which most of us don't have much in the way of memories, and what we do have are usually little fragments rather than full memories, whereas the memories of these complainants are incredibly detailed. They're remarkable. In fact, they're so detailed, I was at one point going to write a book called The Policeman and the Pink Nightie, because the policemen always ask these people, can you remember what you were wearing? And quite often they say, oh, I used to have a Barbie nightie, so I was wearing my pink nightie. And it's remarkable how often in these cases that comes up. Policemen are obsessed with weather and clothes, apparently. But they claim to remember thoughts, feelings they had, conversations. They'll give verbatim accounts of conversations. We know that people can't remember conversations, even over a period of a few minutes. So remembering them over periods of 30, 40 years, which is what these people are doing, is pretty unusual. We've got a huge database of childhood memories, and we virtually never see anything like the sort of details that are remembered by these complainants. And I've come to the view that for at least some of these complainants, their memories can't be true. But on the other hand, their general memory of childhood adversity probably is correct. They did come from a bad background. They were treated badly when they were a child. And I've equally become convinced that only a relatively small number of complainants are actively making up their memories. Some of them do. In England, there's a thing called the Criminal Compensation Committee, and if a crime's been committed against you, you will be compensated. And often these people are from really very impoverished backgrounds, so if you can pick up 60,000 quid from the government because you've been abused, then maybe you'll make up anything to do that. But I think they're a small number. Instead, I think what actually happens is that people think about, obviously, their past when they're narratively thinking, and fragments come to mind, and they try to make sense of those fragments. And if you've had a very difficult life, you had a very difficult childhood, and some fragment comes to mind, then you might interpret it in terms of abuse, and you might try and imagine what happened, and you may end up with a set of imagined memories, which for you are memories, you remember those memories, of incidents of sexual abuse. They usually call it imagination inflation is the term used in the literature. And so these are narratives which create the past, but they create it and make it meaningful for the individual. All right? And maybe that's the point about some of these sex abuse narratives. Right, got us back on track for time, Sam, after your very, very lengthy introduction. So I thought we might move off sexual abuse, which is a fairly horrible topic, and end on something a bit more light-hearted, which is the memories of politicians. Bearing in mind, of course, that we are all politicians. So politicians are a group in which false memories and other fictions are often very prominent. So Ronald Reagan gave a wonderful account of a very emotional, vivid memory of presenting a medal to a World War II soldier, which was in fact taken word for word from a film called A Wing and a Prayer. And even when he was shown it, he denied that's where he got it from. He still remembered giving this brave soldier his medal. There's a great Hillary Clinton memory of a trip to Bosnia when she was Foreign Secretary. She probably wouldn't want to be reminded of it right now, but her memory of it is an interview in Time where they land in this helicopter and they've got flak jackets on and everything, and there's kind of shooting going and stuff, and they have to crouch down and run to this military vehicle and then get in it quickly and they zoom off to wherever they're going to have their meeting. But in fact, there's newsreel footage of her landing in Bosnia, in Air Force One, being greeted by loads of officials driving big flashy Bentleys in black suits and things like that, and being gently taken off to a wonderful, kind of, rendezvous somewhere. And rather brilliantly, she said, I thought, she was questioned about this and said, well, your memory of this thing is obviously completely wrong, because this is what's actually happened, we've got it on film. And she said, yeah, I'm human, I just made a mistake. Which I thought, out of all of these politicians, it probably showed the most political skill. And as Bush's memory of seeing the first plane hit the tower in 9/11, in fact, he was in a school at the time. If you've seen the Michael Moore movie, you will know that. And just sat there for an hour with his hand, his head on his hand, just staring at the floor when he was given the news. So he didn't see it. He may have seen it in a newsreel later on, but he certainly didn't see it at the time, which is what he claimed. Tony Blair, British Prime Minister in the 1990s, has a memory of having watched a football player, a guy called Jackie Milburn. He played for Newcastle United. Now, Blair's constituency was in a place called Trimdon, which is in the northeast of England, very near Newcastle. And so this guy, Jackie Milburn, was kind of a folk hero in those parts. The only problem was that he stopped playing in the early 1950s before Blair was born. Another one I particularly like is Mitt Romney's, he was the running mate of the last presidential candidate, of attending the Golden Jubilee marking the 50th anniversary of the automobile industry in Detroit, which in fact took place 9 months before he was born. And then there's the great Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'll be back, remembering being inspired to enter politics after watching the Nixon-Humphrey presidential debate in the 60s on TV. The problem there was it was never televised. There are many more of these. I should have pulled some more out, actually, because they're all amusing. I mean, what they do is they create narratives which invariably link them into the societies, communities, and cultural history in ways that portray themselves, that they're clear to be appealing to voters. You know, I'm a solid guy, I saw this footballer play in his heyday and this type of thing. Right? The interesting thing is that many of these politicians seem to completely believe in their fictional narratives and are happy to tell them to journalists who they must know are going to immediately go off and check them out. You know, did this ever happen? Could this person have ever been there? All of them must have known that when they told about these memories. But for them, I think the point is they really are memories. You know, through the process of narrative thinking, they've created these memories which define them as a particular sort of person. And that's perhaps the major function of narrative thinking, defining, creating, maintaining a particular self. Right, let's finish up there then, shall we? So false or fictional autobiographical memories often support what we might term a self-narrative, a part of the self-memory system, which is expressed in the core network. They're generated in the same brain networks as autobiographical memories, and in this respect they are not unlike. True, if there's such a thing as a true autobiographical memory. I don't think there is. We could talk about that later if you want. They allow us to have selves that have a consistent and meaningful, that is coherent, relationship with the past and with the future, even if some or all of the narrative is fictional. Thank you.
I want to bring this concept of mindfulness. The notion of mindfulness is linked to meditation and self-realization. And there's the whole notion of is mindfulness a mechanism for suppressing narrative thinking, or is mindfulness itself narrative thinking?
I have to say, sadly, it's one I've come across before. You might want to say that narrative thinking is the opposite of mindfulness. Because, of course, in that particular Buddhist type of meditation, you're supposed to empty your mind, if that's possible. I suspect that both things are of equal value. One is being able to switch off the narrative for some period of time, and the other is to be able to fully indulge in it. And I think if you can't have these narratives, then that's damaging for the self and the development, ongoing development of the self. On the other hand, it might be, if you just switch them off for 10 minutes now and again, that might be fairly fulfilling. So, maybe both have benefits in different ways. One, allowing you to, well, I know the idea is in mindfulness, you're kind of resting the mind, but I don't see how that can happen. What you're doing is you're keeping things out of consciousness. Right? The mind is still rumbling away there. If you look at people who are meditating, then you find that huge areas of their brain are active as well, the default system's active. So maybe it's a way of controlling consciousness rather than narrative as such. The narratives are probably still running along underneath consciousness. Why it's beneficial, I'm not so sure, because I think we should be indulging our daydreams and recognizing that it's an important part of ourselves.
So, yeah, some people hear voices because of medical condition. Because of medical condition, some people hear voices, and the message they get is normally false. But some people claim that they get true messages, genuine messages, through voices because of a spiritual power or psychic power. Do you think that this is also one kind of medical condition?
Interesting question. So what you're saying is that some people have auditory hallucinations, and they value those hallucinations. I'm not sure what to say in response to that, but I mean, auditory hallucinations are normally one of the defining diagnostic features of schizophrenia. But then madness and genius are always close together. So I think if you hear voices and you're happy with that, I'm really not joking about this, but if you do, then I think that's great. And it could be spiritually fulfilling as well.
Okay.
Oh, wait. Oh, me first?
Hi. Good evening.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, it was a good talk about self-narrative, but I would like to ask you about minor bipolar. Those who are actually facing minor bipolar, because a friend of mine, her mother has a minor bipolar, so she's been telling stories of her own, which actually didn't happen. So is this one of the symptoms that whatever that you have just mentioned could be a symptom of minor bipolar, or it's just that they're just making up stories?
Well, that's an interesting question too. I mean, so basically she's having mood swings from depression to mania, and she's confabulating. So if I was involved in that case, I'd definitely want to get her brain scanned. There may be some injury there that's leading to that, but it's not that unusual in certain psychological illnesses, rather than neurological illnesses, for confabulations to arise. Obviously, in schizophrenia, people have delusions, right? And those delusions are often based on memories. So certainly, I've written about some of these. I mean, one case was a man who had this paranoid fear that if he went out of the house, he was going to be kidnapped by some men in a white van, thrown in the back of it and beaten up, and so he wouldn't go out of the house. And it turned out during the course of his treatment that this in fact had happened to him, but he couldn't recognize it as a memory. And so in some of these illnesses, what happens is things that are memories are no longer experienced as memories. Right? And I'm not sure how this relates to the case of your friend, but it may be that it's to do with the psychological illness rather than some brain damage. But I'd be tempted, given she's confabulating, to get a neuropsychologist to give you an opinion.
Good evening, Professor. Hi. Oh. All right, I just got one question. If memories can be fictionally produced, how reliable is a lie detector test For example, when somebody answers a question and gets worried because he's thinking about something that possibly happened to him, but at the same time didn't happen to him, how do you actually answer that?
Well, lie detector tests are, pretty notoriously unreliable. And there's probably a lot going on when one's undergoing one of those tests. For example, excuse me, some people may be highly anxious, and that may be enough to, give a pattern that is interpreted as them lying. So it might be the emotion that's involved in those situations which is driving the sort of signal one's picking up. Certainly, if you use EEG, and we published a paper on this, blimey, 15 years ago, and you get people to recall memories they believe to be true versus make up a memory, then there's pretty much no difference you can detect between the two states. So, sorry about this. I think it's a bit of a not very positive answer, sorry about this, but I think I'd want to look a bit more closely at what exactly was happening in the lie detection situation.
You mentioned patients who were unable to daydream. Have you observed any detrimental effects to this, being unable to daydream?
Sorry, I just didn't catch that. I observed patients who are...
You mentioned patients who were unable to daydream. Have you observed any detrimental effects to the inability to daydream?
Now this is a good question, and I have to tell you, the point is our research hasn't advanced enough to be able to give you an answer on that. But I'm quite interested in trying to look at things like ego stability, personality traits, and how they may or may not be related to the ability to have, dynamic, fluid daydreams. And I suspect that people who don't daydream or can't daydream, perhaps because of brain injury, have cells which are kind of frozen in time. They can't evolve, as it were. That's what I suspect, but I don't know. Good question.
We all have schema and set expectations of the world, usually because of the culture we grow up in. So would you say that schema affects or dictates narrative thinking, or does narrative thinking dictate schema?
Big question. Well, I would have thought that any long-term knowledge we have, which is in long-term memory, can participate in narrative thinking. So to that extent, I think things like schemas would feature. I mean, we know that if you ask people to imagine events that might happen tomorrow, then they can give us some very specific answers. Next week, still relatively specific. Next year, well, they start to become vaguer and they become more schematic. Right? So I think, excuse me, there's probably certainly imagining the future, you lose specificity as you go into the future and things become more schematic. So that probably is good evidence that schemas do take part in narrative thinking, but I don't think we narratively think that much really about what we're going to be doing in 10 years' time. So that might be a rare aspect of that type of thinking.
Thank you, Professor Martin, for a very fantastic talk. My questions are surrounding the truth in narrative thought. So my first question is, how do we know whether we are making sense? In other words, I'm asking about how does our mind fact-check itself? I'm assuming that everybody doesn't want to lie. They simply cannot differentiate whether they are lying or truth. So that's my first question. And the second one is, when you say that 1 in 5, you saw in your studies that 1 in 5 people have false childhood memories, are we talking about typical people or people with no neurological pathologies? And the final one is, how much of a typical memory or narrative thought can we accept as truth based on your findings? So like if somebody told me I heard, I remembered, how many % of that is typically acceptable?
Yeah, I knew it was going to be difficult when you said my first question, which I can't remember actually, but generally you seem to be asking questions about how do we know things are true or not, right? And I think a lot of the time we don't, particularly when we're talking about, you know, things from our lives. On the other hand, we do know whether things are consistent or inconsistent. And it may be that some of these perceptions of inconsistency are things which lead us to judgments of whether something's true or false. You know? So I believe my father was a kind, caring person, so if I remember he once did something pretty nasty to me, maybe I'll just reject that and think I've got that wrong. Right? So I'm being narratively consistent, for example. What percentage of narratives are true depends on what you mean by true. So there's a distinction that the philosopher Bertrand Russell made between theories of truth. So one set of theories of truth are what he called correspondence theories. So something's true because it corresponds to a state of the world, right? Or perhaps it's true because it corresponds to a past state of the world. On the other hand, a theory of truth might be true because a proposition in it is coherent with all the other propositions in it. And I think our memories are more like that coherent account. So if you imagine the dimension that runs from correspondence to coherence, at correspondence end, you've got literal memories of every second of experience, which none of us have. And on the other hand, you've got completely fantasy memories, which are nonetheless coherent. Then our memories, in my view, lie 3/4 of the way along the line towards coherence. So I'd say maybe 25% is corresponds. I mean, just to think about it, just to put it another way, perhaps. Let's imagine next week you're talking to your friend, you're remembering this lecture this guy gave from England, right? And it takes you, what, a maximum of 2 minutes to remember the lecture. But unfortunately, you had to endure an hour and a half of it when you were here. So all memories are time compressed in that way. And in that sense, all memories are to some degree false. There are other aspects as well, but that's one.
Hello.
Hi.
First of all, thanks for your talk. I remember you saying that patients with Alzheimer's don't daydream. Now, is it possible to say what's going on in their minds instead?
Again, a good question, and I wouldn't want you to take away the message from this talk that I've said patients with Alzheimer's don't daydream. The 5 we looked at didn't. There are many more. Maybe they do daydream, or maybe in the early phases of the disease they daydream in dysfunctional ways. And there may be other diseases of aging which impair narrative thinking. So the court is out yet until we get some good, solid, decent research. I don't think we can reach any firm conclusions about that. But what the patients say is, they just say, like Ledoux's patients, my mind is blank. And I have noticed that myself. I've done a reasonable amount of work with dementing patients, and if you just have a conversation with them, you know, they're sitting around in the room at the home or whatever, and you say, oh, what are you doing? What's on your mind? They'll just say nothing. So it might be that, you know, the daydreaming is going on, but they're just not conscious of it. So what's happened is they've suffered an impairment of consciousness. It could even be, I suppose, some sort of emotional thing that they just don't want to have these thoughts, which are often about the future anyway. So, you know, amnesic patients can't think about the future. If you say to someone who's got antegrade amnesia, condensed antegrade amnesia, so they can't form new memories, if you say to them, what are you doing next week? They can't give you an answer. So it might be you need a fully intact, dynamic, functional memory that allows you to generate memories of the past and imagine the future before you can have narrative thinking. So it may be in these patients that a lot of them will be amnesic, that they've lost that ability and that's impaired their ability to think narratively. But we need to look at a few more than 5.
Hi, Professor. Sorry for hogging the mic again. Is deja vu fictional memory?
I'm sorry, I just...
Is deja vu fictional memory?
Well, interesting question.
Thank you.
At least you didn't start by saying my first question is. Actually, we have done work on deja vu, particularly in a group of patients who have persistent deja vu. So they're having deja vu experiences kind of all the time. The way we interpreted that was that there's a part of the temporal lobes that keeps generating recollective experience. So you keep having a feeling that you're remembering. And this part of the temporal lobes has come out of control of the executive processes, so it just fires all the time. And it turns out with these patients that one of the things they most often experience recollective experience to are novel things, which is kind of counterintuitive. So they won't watch television because they claim that everything on TV is a repeat. They don't read the newspaper because the news is always the same. They don't reply to letters because they believe they've already done it. Right? And they drive their partners absolutely insane with this behaviour. But for them, it's because they actually feel that they've done it. They have the experience of remembering. So I think that's probably separate from narrative thinking, although narrative thinking may trigger these, what we call cognitive feelings, feelings of remembering, for example. I'm not sure whether that really answered your question, but thank you.
Yeah, Professor, coming back to your childhood sort of thing, if you ask a child of 3 or 4 years old and say, what do you want to become? He will say, yeah, I want to become Superman. Well, is that fictional or whatever, although he himself cannot be a Superman or Spider-Man, but a child of 3 or 4 would say, yeah, I'd like to be a Spider-Man or a Superman or something like that, Now, that is a childhood side. Now you're going back to the elderly, and when he said, I want to be a Superman due to some illness or a Spider-Man, we think that that's not correct. But it's okay for a child to say something like that. Now, next question is, can we say that the elderly now is living a second childhood? Thank you.
Well, I've got plenty of friends who want to be Superman. and I'm 63. And I still imagine I might play for England yet. But, I think it's healthy to have what are unattainable goals. Maybe they help you to attain the ones that are attainable. I see nothing wrong with that. I think the whole thing about narrative thinking is you need to be as creative as you can be and allow the narrative to flow and go where it might. What would happen if you were Spider-Man? Well, that'd be pretty good, wouldn't it? So I wouldn't say it's a second childhood. I think it's just the background to our narrative thinking of having these fantastic images of the self. And that's probably how those people came to invent and write those cartoons in the first place, that they imagined themselves in those roles. So I'm all for it. Second childhoods, I'm there.
You mentioned something about possibly training people to daydream, people who didn't have the function of daydreaming anymore. How would that work?
Good question. Well, one thing we thought we might do is we thought we might just try to get people to try to imagine themselves in different situations, and then maybe answer some questions about that. We haven't really given it that much thought, but we were thinking with these patients, these pathological aging patients, if we could get them to start doing that, maybe that might, kickstart some of these networks that would mediate that sort of narrative thinking. The idea being that if for some reason you're not using particular networks in the brain, they start to degrade. So if you can get them kind of functioning again, then maybe you can restore some of these cognitive processes. So I'm afraid it's as simple as that. We're just going to ask people to imagine very simple things. Imagine you're outside walking around on the lawns rather sitting in this room. Tell me what the weather's like. Tell me how it feels. What's the grass like? What can you smell? In an attempt to try to get the narrative thinking going again, or at least the image-based aspect of it. So I'm afraid that's as far as we've got on that one.
Hi, good evening, Professor. I'm right here.
Oh, hi.
Hi. So just wondering, since while we're sleeping, we're also in a resting state and we're not task-oriented. So does that also make it somehow similar to daydreaming?
Well, people like Jerome Singer, who did all the important work on daydreaming in the 1960s and 70s, really in the 1980s as well, felt there was a continuity between daydreaming and night dreaming. All right. I'm less convinced myself, because the problem with dreaming at night when you're asleep is that the frontal system is powered down. It's not switched off. You can't switch off any areas of the brain, but it just functions at a much lower level of activity. And so the temporal lobe and these posterior areas, they're not powered down, they're highly active. So it seems to me that daydreaming without executive control would be like night dreaming. But of course, when we daydream, we always have executive control. So I think the two probably are different, although the meaningfulness in them may not be. And another thing about daydreams, which makes them a bit like night dreams, is they're quite hard to remember. So I remember Singer did some experiments where they'd interrupt people when they were daydreaming, but they'd do it at a delayed time, maybe a couple of minutes or something like that. And they couldn't remember what they'd been daydreaming about quite often. When you think about it, it's quite a difficult thing, you know. So what was I daydreaming about? I don't know, when I was coming over here in the taxi. Well, I have no idea. So they're difficult things to remember, rather like night dreams. So they certainly have that similarity. Somebody over there, I think.
We have only a few more minutes, so we'll be taking maybe another 2 questions.
All right. Hi. Enjoyed the lecture, by the way. Are narratives a fundamental way to see our lives, or is it something that we could have adopted from like cultural productions, like, you know, movies and books and stories, like which have an inherent start and end to it?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think I'd want to say that narrative thinking shouldn't be confused with a narrative. So a narrative is usually something that's public, that's out there, that you can take apart, criticize, or accept, or do whatever. Whereas narrative thinking is more about this dynamic thought process going on in your mind. And I think it often is story-like, and it has a theme, it has coherence, it has this internal, external perspective to it. I tend to think that stories are like narrative thinking rather than narrative thinking is like stories. An author once, a very famous author, once said, his advice to upcoming authors was, never write your autobiography before you've written your first novel. The idea being that you'd use up all the material that you might otherwise use. Obviously, there's a relationship between stories and memories. There must be. If you ever listen to any authors who are interviewed, they will always say that, you know, a good part of what they've written is autobiographical, although a good part of it is also imagined. And maybe that's how it is when we're narratively thinking as well. So there definitely is a connection between the two.
Thank you.
Hello. I'd like to ask regarding daydreaming or maybe narrative due to maybe induced by drugs or something. Because I had a mother who had dementia, and initially the doctors were giving us a certain medication, and she imagined that she was walking and in a nice place and then on train and then asked me to invite relatives and friends to visit her in the hotel. But then the next day when they adjusted the medication, she realized that she was in the hospital and she was bedridden and all this. So could it be that drug-induced could also cause, like in this case, narrative things? And like in the case of Alzheimer's disease, you mentioned that they can't daydream. Could it be that if you add in certain, like let's say, hallucinogen, like LSD or something, they would also daydream?
Yeah, it's interesting that frontal lobe patients who've got brain damage in the frontal lobes, and it may have been your mother had the type of Alzheimer's that starts in the frontal lobes rather than the posterior cortex, often have fantasies about where they are. So if they're in hospital, they'll say they're in a hotel. Or if you say to them, well, where is this place? And so it's a golf club. My colleague's coming, he's just finishing work, he's going to meet me here, and then we're going to go out in these green fields and have a game of golf. So, but what they're doing when they're doing that is they're just trying to make sense of their physical surroundings. But they haven't got the cognitive machinery to be able to do that accurately.
One more other question. My mom also, I think, mixed up her narrative because lady, a number of times she has said that she's going to US and she's going to see the Queen of England in the US. I told her the Queen of England is in England. But she keeps on insisting and she says that, oh, I'm going to go there on a trip and the Queen of England is going to invite me and meet me and so on. So is it some sort of mixed up between England and US and so on? That's why I'm wondering, how does that happen? I mean, and now she's on medication and she knows that she's at home, but she still have all these mixed up thoughts.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've got a friend of mine whose mother's got Alzheimer's, and she talks to me a lot about the mother who remembers their life in London very well when they were little, but then drifts off into crazy fantasies about things that never happened. And then she's got some insights. So her daughter, who's in her 40s, will say to her, "Come on, Mum," and she'll go, "Oh, maybe I'll stop talking now." But it's unusual for a dementing patient to have insights. They're usually what's called anosognotic, so they have no conscious insight into the fact that their cognition's going wrong. But it sounds to me like your mother has a good sense of humour.
Thank you so much for all those interesting questions. That concludes our session today. Thanks for your attendance.